The autumn wind carried whispers through the corridors of the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence, where Niccolò Machiavelli sat hunched over his writing desk, while scratching against parchment in the dim candlelight. The year was 1513, and the former secretary of the Florentine Republic found himself in exile, stripped of his position, his influence, and nearly his life. Yet in this moment of personal downfall, he was crafting what would become one of history's most enduring treatises on power and leadership. As Machiavelli paused to dip his quill in ink, his mind wandered to the countless rulers he had observed, advised, and watched rise and fall. Each had possessed the trappings of authority, armies, titles, wealth, yet so many had seen their power crumble not through external conquest, but through internal corruption. Not corruption of gold or flesh, but something far more insidious, the corruption of truth itself. The candlelight flickered across his weathered face as he recalled a conversation with Cesare Borgia, the Duke of Valentinois, whose meteoric rise and catastrophic fall had captivated all of Europe. The people, Borgia had once told him with characteristic arrogance, believe what they wish to believe. Truth is merely what the powerful declare it to be. At the time, Machiavelli had noted the Duke's words with the detached interest of a diplomat. Now, years later, he understood them as the epitaph of failed leadership. For what Borgia and countless others had failed to grasp was that authority built upon falsehood is authority built upon sand. The very lies that seem to strengthen a leader's position in the moment become the foundation of their eventual destruction. This was not merely a philosophical observation for Machiavelli, it was a hard-won lesson carved from the political chaos of Renaissance Italy, where city-states rose and fell with the seasons, and where he had witnessed firsthand the devastating consequences of leadership based on deception rather than strategic truth. The first dangerous falsehood that destroys authority is perhaps the most seductive, the belief that power can be maintained through the manipulation of perception alone. This fallacy whispers to leaders that as long as they can control what people see and hear, they need not concern themselves with underlying realities. It is a siren song that has lured countless rulers into the rocky shoals of political disaster. Machiavelli had witnessed this delusion in action during his service to Piero Soderini, the Gonfalonier of Florence. Soderini, a man of genuine good intentions but fatally flawed judgment, had convinced himself that he could maintain Florence's independence through a combination of diplomatic doublespeak and wishful thinking. Rather than building genuine military strength or forging reliable alliances, Soderini spent his energy crafting elaborate fictions about Florence's strategic position and military capabilities. The consequences were predictable and devastating. When the French armies that had been Florence's protection were driven from Italy, and when the Medici family marshaled their forces for a return to power, Soderini's carefully constructed illusions evaporated like morning mist. The authority he thought he had built through clever manipulation revealed itself to be nothing more than a house of cards in a hurricane. Within days, the elaborate fiction collapsed, taking with it not only Soderini's government but the Republic itself. What Soderini had failed to understand, and what Machiavelli now saw with crystalline clarity, was that authority cannot be divorced from capability. The moment a leader's actual capacity to deliver results falls below the expectations they have created through false promises, their authority begins its inevitable decline. This is not a matter of public relations or communication strategy, it is a fundamental law of political physics as immutable as gravity itself. The tragedy deepens when leaders become trapped within their own deceptions. Having built their position on false claims about their strength, wisdom, or achievements, they find themselves unable to acknowledge limitations or failures without admitting to the very lies that elevated them. This creates a vicious cycle where each new falsehood must be larger than the last to cover the growing gap between perception and reality. Machiavelli recalled observing this dynamic in the court of Louis XII of France, where he had served as a Florentine envoy. The French king, intoxicated by early military successes in Italy, had convinced himself and his court that French arms were invincible and French diplomacy infinitely subtle. Rather than honestly assessing the limits of French power or the growing coalition of enemies assembling against him, Louis surrounded himself with advisors who fed him increasingly elaborate fantasies about French dominance. The king's authority within his court appeared absolute, no one dared contradict his increasingly grandiose pronouncements. Yet this apparent strength masked a fatal weakness. Because Louis had built his authority on the fiction of French invincibility, he was psychologically and politically incapable of making the strategic retreats and compromises that might have preserved French influence in Italy. When military defeats finally shattered the illusion, they took with them not just French territorial ambitions but Louis's credibility as a strategic leader. This pattern repeats itself across centuries and continents because it stems from a fundamental misunderstanding of what authority actually is. True authority derives not from the ability to make people believe falsehoods, but from the capacity to deliver genuine value, security, prosperity, justice, or progress in ways that others cannot replicate. When leaders confuse the trappings of authority with authority itself, they inevitably find themselves defending an empty shell while their real power drains away through the cracks in their constructed facade. The poison of tactical deception. The second dangerous falsehood that undermines authority is the belief that tactical deceptions, small lies told to achieve immediate advantages, are cost-free tools of leadership. This misconception is particularly seductive because tactical deceptions often do provide short-term benefits. A leader can avoid immediate consequences by misrepresenting facts, deflecting blame, or making promises they have no intention of keeping. These small victories can feel like evidence of political skill, reinforcing the dangerous habit of choosing expedient lies over difficult truths. Machiavelli had observed this pattern most clearly in his dealings with Pope Julius II, the warrior pope whose political machinations had reshaped the balance of power in Italy. Julius possessed genuine strategic vision and considerable personal courage, yet he consistently undermined his own authority through a pattern of tactical deceptions that eventually poisoned his relationships with allies and enemies alike. The Pope's method was to make commitments to multiple parties while privately maintaining contradictory intentions. He would promise support to one city-state while secretly negotiating with their enemies, or assure allies of his peaceful intentions while simultaneously planning military campaigns. In the short term, this approach allowed Julius to maximize his options and avoid difficult choices. Each individual deception seemed minor and justifiable given the complex political environment of Renaissance Italy. Yet Machiavelli watched as these accumulated deceptions gradually eroded the Pope's most valuable political asset, his credibility. Allies began requiring increasingly elaborate guarantees before committing to papal initiatives. Enemies found it easier to form coalitions against a leader whose word had lost its value. Most dangerously, Julius's own advisors learned to discount his stated intentions, making it impossible for him to coordinate complex political and military strategies that required genuine trust and shared understanding. The fundamental error in tactical deception lies in treating trust as an infinitely renewable resource rather than recognizing it as a finite asset that, once depleted, cannot be easily restored. Each small lie withdraws from an account of credibility that has been built through previous honest dealings. While the immediate cost may seem negligible, the cumulative effect can be catastrophic. Machiavelli understood that this dynamic is particularly dangerous for leaders because they rarely have complete information about how their deceptions are being perceived and tracked by others. What seems like a clever tactical advantage to the deceiver may be obvious manipulation to the deceived. Allies who appear to accept a leader's explanation may be privately noting the discrepancy between words and actions, filing it away for future reference. The Italian political environment provided numerous examples of how accumulated tactical deceptions could destroy even the most powerful leaders. The Medici family, masters of Florentine politics for generations, had built their influence partly through a sophisticated understanding of when honesty served their interests and when deception was necessary. However, when Giovanni de' Medici became Pope Leo X, he fell into the trap of believing that the tactical deceptions that had served him as a private citizen would work equally well in the papacy. Leo's pontificate became a masterclass in how short-term deceptions can undermine long-term authority. He made contradictory promises to European monarchs about his positions on territorial disputes, assured church reformers of his commitment to addressing corruption while privately selling offices to fund his lifestyle, and repeatedly pledged military support to allies while lacking both the resources and genuine intention to follow through. Each individual deception seemed reasonable given the immediate pressures Leo faced. Promising reform bought him time with critics without requiring immediate action. Assuring monarchs of his support for their various claims allowed him to maintain diplomatic relationships without choosing sides. Making military commitments he couldn't keep preserved the appearance of papal authority while avoiding the costs of actual military intervention. Yet the cumulative effect was to transform the papacy from a respected arbiter in European affairs into a distrusted participant whose commitments carried little weight. Foreign powers began negotiating around papal positions rather than through them. Church reformers grew increasingly radical as they lost faith in the possibility of change from within. Most critically, Leo found himself unable to mobilize support when genuine crises threatened his position, because potential allies had learned through experience that papal promises were unreliable. The tragedy of tactical deception is that it creates a feedback loop that becomes increasingly difficult to escape. As leaders lose credibility through small lies, they find themselves in weaker positions that seem to require additional deceptions to maintain. The short-term relief provided by each new lie reinforces the pattern while making the eventual reckoning more severe. Machiavelli observed that leaders caught in this cycle often compound their problems by increasing the boldness of their deceptions rather than returning to honest dealing. Having lost the ability to achieve their goals through straightforward means, they convince themselves that more elaborate lies will restore their position. This approach virtually guarantees eventual exposure and disgrace, as the gap between claimed reality and actual circumstances becomes too large to sustain. The delusion of permanent control. The third and, perhaps most devastating falsehood that destroys authority is the belief that political control, once achieved, can be made permanent through the right combination of strategies and tactics. This delusion has toppled more governments and destroyed more leaders than foreign invasion or natural disaster. It stems from a fundamental misunderstanding of the dynamic nature of political power and the inevitable changes that time brings to any human organization. Machiavelli had witnessed this delusion destroy some of the most capable leaders of his era, men who had demonstrated exceptional skill in achieving power but who fatally believed that the methods that brought them to authority could indefinitely preserve it. The most instructive case was that of Cesare Borgia, whose rapid conquest of the Romagna had demonstrated political and military genius of the highest order, yet whose fall proved equally rapid once he succumbed to the belief that his position was secure. Borgia's initial success had come from his clear-eyed assessment of political realities. He understood that his authority rested on his father's papal power, the loyalty of his military commanders, and the acquiescence of conquered populations who preferred his efficient rule to the chaos that had preceded it. His policies during his period of expansion showed sophisticated understanding of how to build genuine popular support while maintaining military strength and diplomatic flexibility. Yet success bred the dangerous illusion of permanence. As Borgia's control over his territories solidified, he began to act as though his position was guaranteed rather than contingent. He reduced his attention to the delicate network of relationships that sustained his power, assuming that past loyalty guaranteed future support. He made long-term plans that required political circumstances to remain unchanged, failing to prepare for the inevitable shifts in papal politics, international relations, and local conditions that would eventually threaten his position. Most fatally, Borgia began to believe that he could control the timing and nature of challenges to his authority. When Pope Alexander VI's death created an immediate crisis for the Borgia family's position, Cesare found himself unprepared for a succession process that had always been predictable in its occurrence if not its outcome. His assumption that he would be able to manage the transition revealed the extent to which the illusion of permanent control had compromised his strategic judgment. This delusion manifests itself in multiple ways, each equally destructive to long-term authority. Leaders convince themselves that they can permanently solve political problems rather than managing them as ongoing challenges. They believe that temporary coalitions represent permanent alliances, or that current economic conditions will continue indefinitely. Most dangerously, they assume that their personal authority is somehow separate from the circumstances that created it. Machiavelli observed this pattern repeatedly in the unstable political environment of Renaissance Italy. The Sforza family's rule in Milan had been built through a combination of military prowess, economic management, and diplomatic skill that made them indispensable to Milan's prosperity and security. Yet successive generations of Sforza rulers gradually convinced themselves that their family's position was a natural feature of the political landscape rather than an achievement that required constant renewal. This shift in perspective led to critical errors in judgment. The Sforza began taking unnecessary risks, assuming that their established position would protect them from consequences that would destroy less secure leaders. They reduced their investment in the military and diplomatic relationships that had originally brought them to power, treating these as fixed assets rather than relationships requiring ongoing cultivation. Most critically, they failed to adapt their strategies to changing circumstances, believing that methods which had been successful in the past would remain effective indefinitely. The result was a gradual erosion of the family's actual capacity to govern effectively, even as they maintained the outward appearance of authority. When French armies arrived in Italy, the Sforza found themselves with fewer loyal allies, less effective military forces, and reduced popular support than they had assumed. Their belief in the permanence of their position had led them to neglect the very foundations upon which that position rested. This dynamic is particularly insidious because the symptoms of decline are often invisible to the leaders experiencing them. The day-to-day experience of exercising authority can feel unchanged even as the underlying sources of that authority are weakening. Subordinates continue to defer to established leaders, formal processes continue to function, and the immediate environment may show no signs of instability. The recognition that authority has been fundamentally compromised often comes only when a crisis reveals how little genuine support remains. Machiavelli understood that this illusion of permanence is particularly dangerous for successful leaders because success itself creates the conditions that make the illusion believable. A leader who has successfully navigated multiple challenges may reasonably conclude that they have developed permanent expertise in managing political difficulties. Allies who have remained loyal through various trials may seem like reliable permanent assets. Systems and institutions that have proven effective may appear to be permanent features of the political landscape. Yet this reasoning fails to account for the reality that political environments are constantly evolving, often in ways that are invisible until they reach critical thresholds. Loyal allies age, die, or change their priorities based on shifting circumstances. Effective systems become obsolete as technology, economics, or social conditions change. Popular support that seems solid may be based on specific conditions that can disappear rapidly when those conditions change. The belief in permanent control also leads leaders to make strategic errors that would be obvious to them under different circumstances. They overextend their resources, assuming that current capacities will remain available indefinitely. They make enemies unnecessarily, believing that their position is secure enough to absorb the costs of additional opposition. They fail to develop successors or backup plans, assuming that they will always be available to manage crises personally. Perhaps most tragically, leaders who succumb to this delusion often destroy their own achievements through their attempts to make them permanent. In trying to lock in their current position, they create rigidities that prevent adaptation to changing circumstances. Their efforts to eliminate all sources of uncertainty remove the flexibility that originally allowed them to navigate complex political environments successfully. The Renaissance laboratory of failed authority, the Italian peninsula during Machiavelli's lifetime, served as a vast laboratory for studying the failure of authority, where dozens of rulers, republics, and kingdoms rose and fell with startling rapidity. Each collapse provided new evidence for the patterns Machiavelli was beginning to understand, and each leader's mistakes illuminated the deadly consequences of building authority on false foundations. In the Republic of Siena, Machiavelli observed how the delusion of permanent control had infected an entire governing class. The Sienese oligarchy had maintained power for generations through a complex system of factional balance that prevented any single family or group from achieving dominance. This system had proven remarkably stable and had allowed Siena to maintain independence despite being surrounded by larger and more powerful neighbors. Yet by the early 16th century, the Sienese governing class had convinced themselves that their system was so sophisticated and well established that it required no further attention or adaptation. They treated the factional balance that was the source of their stability as a natural feature of Sienese politics rather than an artificial construction that required constant maintenance and adjustment. This complacency led to a series of small errors that gradually undermined the system's effectiveness. Powerful families were allowed to accumulate influence beyond traditional limits because the governing class assumed that established traditions would automatically prevent dangerous concentrations of power. Economic policies were maintained without adaptation to changing commercial conditions because the oligarchy believed that methods which had worked in the past would continue working indefinitely. Most critically, they failed to prepare for the generational change that would bring new personalities and priorities into positions of authority. When external pressures from expanding papal territories and French military campaigns began to strain Siena's resources, the supposedly stable factional system collapsed with shocking speed. Families that had cooperated for decades turned on each other as economic stress made competition for resources more intense. The careful balance that had maintained peace became a source of paralysis as different factions prevented each other from taking decisive action. Within a few years, a system that had seemed permanently stable had destroyed itself through its inability to adapt to changed circumstances. The Sienese collapse illustrated how the illusion of permanent control could affect not just individual leaders but entire institutions. The oligarchy's belief that they had solved the problem of political stability permanently blinded them to the ongoing work required to maintain that stability. Their success in creating a sophisticated system became the source of their failure when they stopped treating that system as an ongoing achievement requiring constant attention. Similar patterns played out across Italy as established authorities found themselves unable to adapt to the rapid changes brought by foreign invasion, technological innovation, and economic transformation. In Naples, the Aragonese monarchy had built authority through effective military organization and careful management of noble privileges. Yet when French armies arrived with superior artillery and different tactical approaches, the Aragonese found themselves unable to adapt their military system quickly enough to maintain their position. The problem was not simply technological. Other Italian states successfully adopted new military innovations. Rather, the Aragonese had convinced themselves that their established methods were inherently superior rather than temporarily effective. This belief prevented them from recognizing the need for fundamental changes until those changes could no longer preserve their authority. The Venetian Republic provided perhaps the most instructive example of how deeply entrenched the illusion of permanence could become. Venice had built one of Europe's most sophisticated commercial and political systems, with institutions that had proven effective for centuries and a governing class that had demonstrated exceptional collective wisdom in navigating countless challenges. Yet even Venice fell victim to the belief that past success guaranteed future survival. The Venetian nobility convinced themselves that their system was so well designed that it could handle any conceivable challenge without fundamental modification. They treated their commercial networks, military capabilities, and diplomatic relationships as permanent assets rather than achievements requiring constant renewal and adaptation. When the discovery of oceanic trade routes began to undermine Venice's position as Europe's primary commercial intermediary with Asia, the Venetian government initially responded with confidence that their established advantages would allow them to adapt successfully. They assumed that their financial resources, commercial expertise, and political stability would enable them to maintain their position regardless of changing trade patterns. This confidence prevented them from making the dramatic strategic shifts that might have preserved Venetian prosperity and independence. Rather than fundamentally restructuring their economy and foreign policy to account for new realities, they made incremental adjustments while assuming that the basic structure of European commerce would eventually return to patterns that favored Venice. The result was a gradual decline that proved irreversible because the Venetians had waited too long to acknowledge the magnitude of the changes they faced. By the time they recognized that their traditional advantages were no longer sufficient, they lacked the resources and flexibility necessary for fundamental restructuring. Their belief in the permanence of their position had led them to miss the window of opportunity for successful adaptation. These examples from across Renaissance Italy revealed to Machiavelli a consistent pattern in the failure of authority. Successful leaders and institutions invariably fell victim to the belief that their methods, systems, or positions were permanent features of the political landscape. This belief led them to stop doing the work that had originally created their success, whether that work involved maintaining alliances, adapting to changing circumstances, or preparing for inevitable transitions. The tragedy was that these failures were not inevitable consequences of external forces but self-inflicted wounds caused by misunderstanding the nature of political authority itself. The same leaders and institutions that had demonstrated exceptional skill in achieving power proved incapable of maintaining it because they confused temporary success with permanent achievement. The mathematics of trust destruction. As Machiavelli reflected on the patterns he had observed, he began to understand that the destruction of authority followed mathematical principles as precise as those governing financial markets or military logistics. Trust, he realized, was not merely a moral concept but a quantifiable political resource with specific rates of accumulation and decay. Leaders who failed to understand these dynamics inevitably found themselves bankrupt in the currency that mattered most for sustaining authority. The mathematics of trust destruction operated according to what Machiavelli came to think of as the principle of asymmetric vulnerability. Building trust required consistent honesty over extended periods, with each instance of truthfulness adding incrementally to a leader's credibility account. Destroying trust, however, could happen with shocking speed, as a single significant deception could eliminate the accumulated value of years of honest dealing. This asymmetry meant that leaders who engaged in tactical deceptions were making extremely poor risk-reward calculations, even when those deceptions provided short-term advantages. The potential gains from any individual lie were necessarily limited. At most, a leader could avoid immediate consequences or achieve temporary strategic benefits. The potential losses, however, were unlimited, as a single exposed deception could destroy a lifetime of accumulated credibility. Machiavelli had observed this dynamic most clearly in his dealings with Girolamo Savonarola, the Dominican friar whose brief control of Florence had demonstrated both the power and the fragility of authority based on moral credibility. Savonarola had built extraordinary influence through his reputation for absolute honesty and his willingness to speak uncomfortable truths about corruption in both secular and ecclesiastical institutions. The friar's authority during his period of influence was qualitatively different from the power exercised by traditional political leaders. Citizens who would resist direct commands from established authorities voluntarily complied with Savonarola's moral guidance because they trusted completely in his honesty and good intentions. This trust allowed him to achieve policy changes and social transformations that would have been impossible through conventional political methods. Yet Savonarola's fall illustrated the mathematical precision with which trust destruction operated. When the friar began making specific prophetic claims about divine intervention in Florentine affairs, promises that God would protect Florence from its enemies and punish the corrupt, he was essentially wagering his entire accumulated credibility on his ability to predict and control events beyond any human power to influence. The failure of these predictions didn't merely reduce Savonarola's influence incrementally. Instead, it created a catastrophic collapse in which his entire accumulated credibility was eliminated almost instantaneously. Citizens who had trusted him completely found that they could no longer trust him at all, because the magnitude of his false claims called into question everything they had previously believed about his honesty and judgment. This pattern revealed what Machiavelli understood to be a fundamental law of political trust. Credibility was not a linear resource that could be spent gradually, but a threshold phenomenon that could disappear entirely once critical limits were exceeded. A leader could make numerous small compromises with complete honesty while retaining substantial credibility, but certain types or magnitudes of deception created cascade failures that eliminated trust entirely. The mathematical precision of this process meant that leaders needed to understand not just the immediate costs and benefits of specific deceptions, but the cumulative impact of their truth-telling record on their capacity for future leadership. Each decision to prioritize short-term advantage over long-term credibility was essentially a financial transaction, with leaders borrowing against their future authority to solve present problems. Machiavelli observed that most failed leaders had never performed this calculation explicitly. They treated their credibility as an unlimited resource rather than recognizing it as the finite foundation upon which all their other capabilities depended. This led them to make increasingly poor decisions as their situations became more desperate, using up their remaining trust in futile attempts to solve problems that required sustained credibility to address effectively. The Medici family's return to Florence provided another clear example of how trust mathematics operated in practice. When the Republic fell and the Medici regained control, they faced a population that had experienced both the benefits and the costs of Republican government. Many Florentines were genuinely willing to accept Medici rule if it could provide superior security and prosperity compared to the factional chaos that had characterized the Republic's final years. The key to Medici's success lay in establishing credibility for their claims about what their rule would provide. Citizens needed to believe that Medici promises about security, economic policy, and political stability were genuine rather than tactical deceptions designed to consolidate power. This requirement created both an opportunity and a vulnerability for the returning family. Giovanni de' Medici, who eventually became Pope Leo X, understood this dynamic and initially governed Florence with careful attention to maintaining credibility. His early policies matched his public commitments, and he avoided making promises that he lacked the capacity to fulfill. This approach allowed him to build genuine popular support that went beyond mere acquiescence to superior force. However, as Giovanni's attention shifted toward papal ambitions and international politics, he began treating Florence as a resource to be exploited rather than a responsibility requiring careful stewardship. He made increasingly grandiose promises about Florence's future prosperity while extracting resources for his papal campaigns. He assured citizens that temporary sacrifices would lead to permanent advantages that he had no realistic plan for delivering. The mathematical precision of trust destruction became apparent as Florentine support for Medici rule began to erode at an accelerating pace. Each failed promise created skepticism about subsequent commitments. Citizens began interpreting even genuine policy initiatives through the lens of suspicion created by previous deceptions. Most critically, the accumulating evidence of dishonesty began to affect how Florentines remembered and evaluated Giovanni's earlier honest dealing. This retrospective contamination represented perhaps the most devastating aspect of trust destruction. Not only did current deceptions reduce future credibility, but they called into question past actions that had seemed genuinely honest at the time. Citizens who discovered that they had been deceived about recent events naturally wondered whether they had also been deceived about earlier events, even when those earlier actions had been completely truthful. The result was a cascade failure in which Giovanni's entire accumulated credibility was eliminated, not just the portion that should have been attributed to his recent deceptions. The mathematical asymmetry of trust destruction meant that years of careful relationship building could be wiped out by months of tactical dishonesty, and that the destruction would be more complete than the magnitude of the recent deceptions alone would justify. Understanding these dynamics helped explain why some leaders who engaged in occasional tactical deceptions maintained their authority while others who seemed to lie no more frequently experienced complete political collapse. The difference lay not in the absolute number of deceptions but in their timing, magnitude, and relationship to the leader's accumulated credibility reserves. Leaders with substantial trust reserves could survive even significant deceptions if they immediately acknowledged their errors and returned to scrupulous honesty. The key was recognizing that they had approached the threshold beyond which trust destruction would become irreversible, and adjusting their behavior before that threshold was crossed. Leaders who failed to understand these dynamics continued making deceptions even after their credibility reserves were exhausted, guaranteeing their eventual political destruction. The architecture of sustainable authority. Through his observation of both failed and successful leaders, Machiavelli began to discern the principles that distinguished durable authority from its brittle imitations. True authority, he realized, was not built upon the ability to control outcomes, but upon the capacity to navigate uncertainty while maintaining the trust necessary for collective action. This understanding pointed toward a fundamentally different approach to leadership, one that embraced rather than denied the inherent limitations of human knowledge and political power. The foundation of sustainable authority lay in what Machiavelli came to understand as strategic honesty, a commitment to truthfulness that went beyond mere moral preference to encompass a sophisticated understanding of how credibility functioned as a political resource. Strategic honesty did not require leaders to share every thought or acknowledge every limitation, but it demanded that they never make claims they knew to be false or promises they lacked the capacity to fulfill. This approach required leaders to develop exceptional skill in distinguishing between what they knew, what they believed, and what they hoped. Strategic honesty allowed for expressing uncertainty about outcomes while maintaining confidence in methods. It permitted acknowledging limitations while demonstrating competence within those limitations. Most critically, it required leaders to resist the temptation to claim knowledge or control they did not possess, even when such claims might provide temporary political advantages. Machiavelli had observed this principle in action during his diplomatic missions to France, where he encountered Louis XII's minister Georges d'Amboise, Cardinal of Rouen. D'Amboise possessed neither the military genius of Cesare Borgia nor the charismatic appeal of leaders like Savonarola, yet he had built and maintained substantial authority within the French court through his consistent demonstration of strategic honesty. The cardinal's approach was to make careful distinctions between what French policy could realistically accomplish and what political circumstances might make possible. When discussing military campaigns, he would acknowledge the limitations of French resources while expressing confidence in French military capabilities. When negotiating diplomatic agreements, he would clearly specify what France could guarantee versus what it hoped to achieve through favorable circumstances. This precision in communication created several advantages that more grandiose leaders lacked. Foreign diplomats learned to trust d'Amboise's commitments because they had been calibrated to match actual French capacities. When he expressed confidence in specific outcomes, his track record of accurate assessment gave his words exceptional weight. When circumstances required France to abandon previous plans, the cardinal's careful distinction between commitments and aspirations prevented these changes from being interpreted as betrayals. Most importantly, d'Amboise's strategic honesty created space for adaptation when circumstances changed. Because he had never claimed that French policy was based on perfect knowledge or permanent conditions, he could modify strategies without admitting to fundamental errors in judgment. His credibility was enhanced rather than undermined by his willingness to acknowledge new information and adjust policies accordingly. This approach required considerable political courage because it meant accepting short-term disadvantages in order to build long-term strength. D'Amboise could have achieved temporary negotiating advantages by overstating French capabilities or making promises he wasn't certain France could keep. However, he understood that such tactical gains would come at the cost of strategic credibility, ultimately leaving France in a weaker position when future negotiations required opponents to believe French commitments. The principle of strategic honesty extended beyond individual communications to encompass the entire structure of how leaders presented their authority. Sustainable leaders learned to base their public image on capabilities they could demonstrate rather than claims they hoped others would accept without verification. This meant investing in actual competence rather than the appearance of competence, and building systems that could deliver results rather than systems designed primarily to impress observers. Machiavelli observed this distinction clearly in comparing the governance of Florence under Piero Soderini with its administration under the early Medici rulers. Soderini had focused heavily on creating impressive governmental structures and elaborate ceremonial displays designed to project an image of republican dignity and strength. The reality behind these appearances, however, was often chaotic and ineffective, with decision-making processes that prioritized consensus building over problem-solving and military preparations that emphasized pageantry over practical capability. The Medici, by contrast, had built their authority on demonstrated capacity to deliver specific benefits that citizens valued: security from external enemies, protection of commercial interests, and effective resolution of disputes that could destabilize civic life. Their governmental structures were often informal and sometimes appeared haphazard to outside observers, but they consistently produced results that matched or exceeded public expectations. This difference in approach reflected a fundamental distinction between authority based on performance and authority based on perception. Leaders focused on perception could achieve impressive short-term success by creating compelling narratives about their capabilities and intentions. However, this approach was inherently unstable because it required continued escalation of claims to maintain credibility, eventually reaching levels that no leader could actually deliver. Performance-based authority, while slower to build and less spectacular in its manifestations, created a foundation that could support sustained leadership even through difficult periods. Citizens who had experienced tangible benefits from a leader's governance were more likely to maintain support during temporary setbacks or policy failures. More importantly, leaders who had built authority through demonstrated competence could acknowledge mistakes and limitations without destroying their credibility, because their track record provided evidence that they could learn from errors and deliver improved results in the future. The construction of sustainable authority also required leaders to develop what Machiavelli recognized as institutional thinking, the capacity to build systems and relationships that could function effectively even when specific leaders were unavailable or made poor decisions. This represented a fundamental shift from the personal charisma model of leadership that dominated Renaissance politics toward a more systematic approach that prioritized enduring effectiveness over immediate dramatic impact. Institutional thinking required leaders to acknowledge that their personal authority was temporary and that their most important responsibility was to create structures that would continue serving their community's interests after they were gone. This perspective encouraged investment in training subordinates, establishing clear decision-making processes, and building relationships based on mutual benefit rather than personal loyalty alone. Perhaps most challenging for leaders accustomed to personal authority, institutional thinking required them to create systems that could function without their constant intervention and that might occasionally override their personal preferences in favor of broader organizational interests. This meant establishing processes for dissent and disagreement that allowed for correction of leadership errors, and creating mechanisms for succession that did not depend entirely on the current leader's judgment about appropriate replacements. The benefits of institutional thinking became apparent during crises that tested the stability of different political systems. Organizations that had developed effective institutional structures could maintain continuity and effectiveness even when individual leaders made poor decisions or became unavailable. Personal loyalty networks, by contrast, often collapsed rapidly when the central figure was removed or discredited, leaving no framework for continued collective action. Machiavelli observed this dynamic most clearly in comparing the resilience of Venetian institutions with the fragility of the various personal tyrannies that dominated other Italian city-states. Venice had developed elaborate systems for collective decision-making, dispute resolution, and leadership succession that allowed the Republic to maintain effectiveness across generations and through multiple external threats. Individual Venetian leaders might make serious errors in judgment, but the institutional framework provided mechanisms for correcting those errors without destroying the entire political structure. Personal tyrannies, regardless of how capable their founders might be, lacked these self-correcting mechanisms and, therefore, proved far more vulnerable to both internal dysfunction and external pressure. The authority of tyrants was entirely dependent on their continued personal effectiveness, creating brittle systems that could collapse completely when circumstances exceeded any individual's capacity to manage them alone. Conclusion: the eternal return of truth. As the candle burned lower in Machiavelli's study and the night deepened around Florence, the exiled diplomat set down his quill and contemplated the lessons that centuries of future readers would struggle to understand. The princes and republics of his time had been laboratories of power, each testing different theories about how authority could be achieved and maintained. The results of these experiments were written in the rise and fall of dynasties, the prosperity and ruin of cities, and the freedom and subjugation of peoples. What emerged from this vast accumulation of political experience was not a simple formula for success, but a complex understanding of the principles that governed the exercise of power across all human societies. Authority, Machiavelli now understood, was not a possession that could be seized and held like gold or territory, but a relationship that existed only as long as it was continuously renewed through effective action and maintained through honest dealing. The dangerous falsehoods that destroyed authority were not merely tactical errors but fundamental misunderstandings about the nature of political power itself. Leaders who believed they could substitute manipulation for capability, who thought tactical deceptions were cost-free tools, or who imagined that any human arrangement could be made permanent, were destined for failure because they were working against rather than with the grain of political reality. The lesson that would echo through the centuries was both simple and profound: sustainable authority must be built upon truth, not because truth is always pleasant or convenient, but because only truth provides a foundation solid enough to support the weight of genuine leadership. Lies might serve tactical purposes, but they could never create the deep credibility required for strategic success. This understanding pointed toward a revolutionary conception of political leadership, one that measured success not by the immediate acquisition of power but by the long-term creation of institutions and relationships capable of serving human needs across generations. Such leadership required courage to acknowledge limitations, wisdom to distinguish between what could be controlled and what could only be influenced, and, above all, the discipline to build authority through demonstrated competence rather than manufactured consent. The Renaissance was ending as Machiavelli wrote, but the lessons embedded in its political chaos would remain relevant as long as human beings sought to organize themselves for collective action. The same principles that governed the rise and fall of Italian city-states would apply to future republics and empires, because they reflected fundamental truths about human nature and the dynamics of social cooperation that transcended any particular historical moment. In the flickering candlelight of that autumn evening in 1513, Niccolò Machiavelli was not merely recording the political failures of his contemporaries but identifying the eternal tensions that would challenge every future leader who sought to exercise authority over their fellow human beings. The dangerous falsehoods that had ruined the princes of Renaissance Italy would tempt their successors across the centuries, and the principles of sustainable authority he was beginning to understand would remain as relevant to future democratic presidents and corporate executives as they were to the dukes and cardinals of his own turbulent age. The truth that Machiavelli discovered in the ruins of Italian independence was that political authority, like all human achievements, could only be sustained through continuous renewal based on honest assessment of circumstances and genuine service to the needs of those who granted that authority. Leaders who understood this truth might build something lasting; those who ignored it were doomed to repeat the failures that had littered the landscape of Renaissance Italy with the wreckage of collapsed dynasties and ruined republics. As he finally extinguished his candle and prepared to retire, Machiavelli reflected on the irony that the most practical advice for ambitious leaders was also the most idealistic: tell the truth, build real capability, and remember that all human authority is temporary. These principles would never guarantee success, but they alone offered the possibility of achievements that might outlast the ambitions of any individual leader and serve the enduring interests of the communities they had been privileged to serve. The dangerous falsehoods would continue to seduce future generations of leaders, promising easy paths to power and permanent solutions to temporary problems. But the lessons written in the political laboratory of Renaissance Italy would remain available to those wise enough to learn from others' mistakes rather than insisting on making them anew. In that possibility lay whatever hope existed for better governance and more sustainable authority in all the centuries yet to come.